The old Scots have a saying, "Where the earth remembers, the sky never forgets." In the mist-choked hills of central Scotland, between the dark waters of two firths, lies a stretch of land that remembers too much. The locals don't speak of it to outsiders, not anymore. They learned long ago that disbelief is more comfortable than truth, that the world prefers its mysteries wrapped in rationalization and filed away in locked drawers. But the land doesn't care what the world prefers. Bonnybridge sits like a secret in the heart of it all. 7,000 souls living ordinary lives in extraordinary territory. Here, children draw pictures of stars that move in school notebooks, and teachers quietly throw them away. Here, the old farmer John MacLeod found his entire herd of cattle standing in a perfect spiral one October morning in 1987, their eyes wide and white with terror, none of them willing to break formation until the sun was fully risen. He sold the farm 3 months later and never spoke of it again. Here, the night sky doesn't behave the way night sky should, and after a while, you stop looking up. The Romans knew something was wrong with this place. When they pushed north into Caledonia 2,000 years ago, building their wall to keep the painted savages at bay, they built it in a strange configuration through this region. The line bends, curves, doubles back on itself in ways that make no military sense. Some historians claim it follows the terrain, but old Roman records tucked away in Vatican archives where a few researchers think to look tell a different story. The legionaries refused to camp in certain areas. They reported lights in the hills that moved with intelligence, not like stars or torches, but like eyes watching, waiting, judging. The Celtic tribes who lived here before Rome, before Christianity, before history became written rather than sung, they knew even more. They built their stones in careful patterns across the land, marking something. Not worshiping, not celebrating, marking, warning. The standing stones of Scotland aren't random. They form a network, a web of ancient surveying that suggests the people who placed them were mapping something invisible, something that moved through the landscape like a current moves through water. In the Gaelic that the old ones still speak in the furthest glens, there's a word, sluag. It means the host, the unforgiven dead who fly through the night sky hunting souls. But the descriptions don't match ghosts or spirits from any Christian tradition. The sluag travel in craft made of light and metal. They take people up into the air. Those who return are changed, speaking in riddles, their eyes different, their dreams full of stars and symbols, and knowledge that tastes like poison. The church tried to suppress these stories, to fold them into demon lore and devil worship. But the stories persisted because they were true, or close enough to truth that suppression only made them stronger. Fast forward to 1947, Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting over Mount Rainier, the birth of the modern UFO age, they call it. But it wasn't a birth, it was a revealing. Whatever flies through our skies didn't suddenly appear in 1947. It simply stopped hiding, or we stopped being able to look away. Arnold's 9 silver craft skipping across the sky like stones on water opened a door in the human psyche. Suddenly, people everywhere began reporting what they'd been seeing for years, decades, centuries. Permission had been granted to speak the unspeakable. Britain watched America's UFO panic with typical reserve until the reports started flooding in domestically. Manchester, Liverpool, London, all the major cities logged sightings. The Ministry of Defense opened files, conducted investigations, maintained the appearance of taking it seriously while ensuring no actual conclusions would ever be reached. But 2 places in the United Kingdom produced numbers that terrified the analysts who saw the raw data. Warminster in Wiltshire where the phenomenon was loud and public and attracted attention from around the world, and central Scotland, where the phenomenon was quieter, more personal, and infinitely more disturbing. The Warminster events were spectacular. Booming sounds, shattered windows, lights dancing over the town like a carnival. Thousands of witnesses, massive media coverage, tourism boards printing UFO maps. It was frightening, but also exciting, communal, almost celebratory. We were not alone, and whatever shared our skies wanted to be seen. Scotland was different. Scotland was surgical. The reports from the Falkirk Triangle weren't about distant lights or ambiguous shapes. They were about craft landing in clearings and opening doors, about beings walking through walls or materializing in bedrooms, about missing time and procedures and examinations conducted with cold precision, about telepathic voices delivering messages that made no sense until years later, until the witness had moved away or died, or simply stopped sleeping properly. The encounters weren't public spectacles. They were intimate violations, and they followed patterns that suggested purpose, methodology, long-term planning. Mary Peterson lived alone in a cottage outside Bonnybridge from 1976 until her death in 2004. She kept journals, 43 volumes filled with dense handwriting, diagrams, attempts to decode what she called the instruction. She claimed that in August 1979, she was taken from her bed into a craft hovering over her garden. Inside, beings she described as wearing the faces of dead relatives, but with eyes like oil, showed her images of the future. Not humanity's future, she insisted, but the Earth's future after humanity. Cities overgrown, seas risen, new things walking where people once walked. They told her this wasn't prophecy, but history. That time was a landscape they could navigate as easily as she walked her garden. Before they returned her, they placed something inside her head, behind her right eye. She could feel it sometimes, she wrote, like a cold marble pressing against the bone. Doctors found nothing in repeated scans, but Mary insisted. The instruction continued, dreams every night, new information downloaded in symbols she spent her waking hours trying to translate. When she died, her nephew found the journals and burned them all. He told the local paper it was what she would have wanted, but those who knew Mary said she wanted them published, wanted someone to understand. The nephew said he couldn't bear reading them, that the later volumes stopped being English entirely, just symbols and equations and drawings of machines that hurt to look at. He burned them in his garden on a Tuesday afternoon, and the smoke, neighbors reported, rose straight up despite a strong wind, rising until it disappeared into a cloudless sky. This is what the Falkirk Triangle does. It takes ordinary people living ordinary lives and shows them things that break them, reshape them, hollow them out, and fill them with something else. The statistics are clinical. Between 1975 and 1995, the region produced over 300 documented close encounter cases. Close encounter in this context means within 500 feet, within touching distance, within breathing distance. Of that 300, over 100 involved direct interaction with occupants. Direct interaction, conversation, telepathy, physical contact, abduction. For comparison, the entire rest of the United Kingdom produced 87 similar cases in the same period. The Falkirk Triangle, an area of roughly 300 square miles, was generating more high strangeness encounters than the remaining 94,000 square miles of Britain combined. The statisticians in the Ministry of Defense looked at these numbers and quietly recommended the files be sealed, not destroyed, sealed. There's a difference. Destruction suggests fear. Sealing suggests that someday someone will need to know. But why here? What makes this specific landscape, these particular coordinates worthy of such sustained attention. The geology is old and wounded. This part of Scotland sits on volcanic rock that hasn't been active for 300 million years, but the energy signatures remain. Sensitive instruments detect fluctuations in the magnetic field, subtle but persistent. Dowsers, those mystical figures the scientific community loves to dismiss, report lines of force crisscrossing the region in patterns that match, almost exactly, the placement of ancient standing stones. As above, so below. The old Hermetic principle, what's in the earth mirrors what's in the sky. Water plays a role too. The Firth of Forth to the east, the Firth of Clyde to the west, dozens of lochs scattered throughout, and beneath it all, underground rivers and reservoirs mapping hidden geographies. Water conducts, holds memory, responds to lunar cycles and cosmic radiation. Many of the most intense encounters occur near water, witnesses reporting craft rising from or descending into lochs, emerging without disturbing the surface, defying physics or operating on physics we haven't discovered yet. And then there's the human element. This region has been continuously inhabited for 8,000 years. Wave after wave of people choosing to live here, despite the harshness of the climate, the difficulty of the terrain. What drew them? What kept them? Ancient cairns dot the hills, burial mounds that, when excavated, reveal positioning that aligns with stellar events, suggesting the dead were buried looking towards specific stars. Why? What were they waiting to see? Or what did they know would return? Rosslyn Chapel, just outside Edinburgh, holds secrets carved in stone. Among the Christian symbolism and medieval pageantry are things that shouldn't exist. Maize and aloe vera, plants from the Americas, carved decades before Columbus sailed. Geometric patterns that encode mathematical constants unknown until the Renaissance. And strangest of all, figures that researchers have tentatively identified as depictions of DNA's double helix structure, rendered in the 15th century, 500 years before Watson and Crick. The official explanation is cultural diffusion, lucky guessing, apophenia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But walk through Rosslyn at dusk when the tourists have gone, stand in the Lady Chapel where the light falls wrong, and feel the weight of the place. Something was being recorded here. Knowledge was being preserved, not Christian knowledge. Something older or newer, or outside time altogether. By the late 1980s, the Falkirk Triangle had been quietly active for decades. Researchers monitoring the situation noted cycles, waves of activity that ebbed and flowed like tides following no lunar calendar. Something was building toward a peak. The Earth was remembering harder, and the sky was paying closer attention. In the summer of 1989, the wave crested. What followed would transform this quiet corner of Scotland into the most documented, most investigated, and least understood UFO hotspot in the world. The encounters would be witnessed by police officers, firefighters, doctors, teachers, people whose careers depended on credibility and who would risk everything to tell the truth of what they saw. The land had been marked long ago. Now it was time to see why. Summer, 1989. The old women of Bonnybridge began dreaming in red and white. Always the same vision. Lights descending from a sky that bled at the edges, getting closer each night until they revealed themselves not as stars but as eyes. Searching, counting, remembering faces. Mrs. Elspeth Grant, who'd lived through the Blitz without flinching, started sleeping with her curtains drawn and her Bible under her pillow. She told her daughter the lights were looking for something they'd lost long ago, and when they found it, there would be a reckoning. 3 weeks later, the firefighters at Shield Hill learned she was right. August 23rd, The house fire was routine, old wiring finally surrendering to time. Michael Davidson had been with Central Scottish Fire Brigade for 12 years, seen hundreds of fires, knew the rhythm of the work. They knocked down the flames, damped the embers, performed the familiar dance of hoses and equipment. The night was cool, the loch nearby mirror still. Davidson was coiling a hose when he noticed the silence. Complete silence. No wind, no birds, no water lapping at the shore. The kind of silence that precedes violence in nature, when every living thing knows to hide. He looked up. The red light hung above Loch Lorrig like a drop of blood suspended in oil. Perfectly circular, perfectly still, perhaps 20 feet above the water. Davidson's mouth opened to call out, but his voice had disappeared into the silence. Then Crew Chief Patterson was beside him and 3 others, all of them staring, all of them feeling it. The weight of attention, the sensation of being observed by something that understood them better than they understood themselves. The light moved. Not the gradual acceleration of aircraft, but instant velocity, 0 to impossible in a heartbeat. It shot over their heads, close enough that Davidson felt the air displace, felt heat that had no source, smelled something like ozone and copper, and underneath it all, rot. Sweet, organic rot, like flowers dying in a closed room. 2 firefighters dropped to their knees, instinct overriding training. The object vanished beyond the trees, leaving afterimages burned into their vision. Patterson found his voice. Equipment malfunction. Burning insulation can create optical effects. He was offering them an exit, a rational box to contain what they'd seen. But before anyone could accept it, the second light appeared. White this time, bright enough to cast their shadows long and wrong across the ground. It emerged from the same position over the loch, as if the water were a doorway. Davidson felt his bowels loosen, felt the monkey brain panic of prey, recognizing predator. The light held position for 2 minutes that stretched like hours. In that time, Davidson experienced something he would never successfully articulate. A voice that wasn't sound, speaking words that weren't language, telling him things about himself he'd never told anyone. His childhood fear of deep water. The recurring dream where his teeth fell out in his hands. The name of his first love, forgotten for 20 years until this moment. The white light crossed over them, lower than the first, and Davidson saw details that would wake him screaming for months. Symbols etched into a surface that seemed to shift between metal and something organic. Characters that hurt to look at directly, that seemed to writhe and reconfigure as his eyes tried to focus. And beneath those symbols, something that might have been windows or might have been eyes, dark and depthless. The third light was red again, larger, emerging from the loch like a birth. It hovered for 10 seconds, then descended toward them, dropping altitude until it hung perhaps 30 feet overhead. The heat intensified. The smell of rot became overwhelming, and Davidson heard it then, what the old women had warned about in their dreams, counting. Something inside that light was counting them, marking them, filing them away in a catalog of specimens observed and documented. Then it rose, accelerated, vanished. Sound returned to the world like a slap. Someone was crying. Patterson was on his radio, voice shaking, demanding to know what aircraft were operating in the area. The response came back. Nothing. No helicopters, no police, no military exercises. The sky had been empty according to every official record. But the sky had not been empty, and now everyone knew it. The incident report Patterson filed was clinical, professional, useless. Words on paper couldn't capture the ontological violation they'd experienced, the sense that reality had cracked and something had looked through from the other side. The story circulated through emergency services, gaining embellishments and losing credibility with each retelling, until it became just another weird tale from Scotland's haunted landscape. Except Michael Davidson started finding things wrong with his memory, gaps appearing like pages torn from a book. He'd lose hours sometimes, come back to himself standing in rooms he didn't remember entering, holding objects he didn't remember picking up. His wife noticed he'd started speaking in his sleep, words that weren't English, weren't any language she recognized. When she recorded him one night and played it back, Davidson listened to his own voice making sounds his throat shouldn't be able to produce and smashed the recorder against the wall. 3 years passed. The gaps in Davidson's memory grew wider, and the lights returned. January 1992. James Walker was driving home along the back roads outside Bonnybridge when his headlights began to dim. Not failing, dimming, as if something were drinking the light. Then the road ahead started glowing with illumination that came from above, from nowhere, from everywhere. Walker stopped the car and felt his hands begin to shake. The lights emerged from the darkness like creatures surfacing from deep water. Red and white, moving in patterns that suggested not randomness but play. The kind of playful cruelty a cat shows a mouse. They danced and swooped, tracing geometries in the air that Walker's eyes couldn't quite follow. Shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3. Then the playfulness stopped. The lights snapped into formation, 2 perfect rows, rigid as soldiers. And Walker understood he was seeing only part of something much larger, the way you might see only the fin of a shark and have to imagine the terrible body beneath. The craft revealed itself slowly, emerging from invisibility like a developing photograph. Triangular, massive, edges defined by the lights that had been dancing. The underside was wrong, textured in ways that suggested biological growth more than mechanical construction. Panels that might have been scales, segmented sections that might have been breathing, and at the center an opening or an eye or an aperture that reflected nothing, absorbed everything, a hole in the world. It passed over Walker's car in absolute silence. No engine roar, no air displacement, nothing but that overwhelming sense of being seen, cataloged, assessed. Walker sat paralyzed, hands welded to the steering wheel as his rearview mirror showed the craft accelerating away with impossible speed, becoming a star, becoming nothing. He sat there for 40 minutes afterward, though his watch showed only 10 had passed. Time was slipping, becoming unreliable. When he finally drove home, he found his wife asleep despite her usual habit of waiting up. She woke confused, insisted she'd only just gone to bed, though it was now past 2 a.m. The house smelled of ozone and something else, something organic and sweet. Walker reported it. The police were sympathetic, professional, helpless. Another incident added to files growing thick with impossible testimony from credible witnesses. But word spread through Bonnybridge like contagion, or like awakening. James Walker saw it. It's real. It's here. March 1992. Isabella Sloggett made a mistake that would scar her children for life. She followed the blue light. It appeared while she walked home with Stephen and Carol, descending from the evening sky with the inevitability of nightfall. The sphere was beautiful at first, pale blue, almost gentle. The children watched with wonder rather than fear as it passed overhead, dropping altitude, heading toward the trees. Stephen wanted to see where it went. Carol was silent, which should have been warning enough. Carol was never silent. Isabella led them through the woods to the clearing. Later, she would never be able to explain why. Some compulsion, some external pressure on her thoughts that felt like her own desire, but wasn't. The craft sat on the ground without touching it, hovering inches above grass that bent away from it in a perfect circle, as if the earth itself were trying to escape. The blue lights pulsed with a rhythm that matched Isabella's heartbeat, then began to influence it, pulling it into synchronization. Her heart started beating to their tempo, and she felt her thoughts beginning to align with something vast and cold and utterly indifferent to her existence. Stephen took a step toward the craft. Isabella's arm shot out, grabbed him, but felt disconnected from her body, like watching someone else move. The hull opened, not mechanically. It simply stopped being solid, became an aperture spilling light that had weight and texture and intention. The light touched the grass and the grass withered. It touched a tree trunk and the bark cracked, oozing sap that steamed in the cold air. Then the sound came, the howl. But howl is too simple a word, too animal. This was machinery and biology fused. The scream of metal tearing combined with the death cry of something immense and ancient. The sound bypassed Isabella's ears, hit her in the chest, in the bones, in the primitive brainstem that still remembered when humans were prey. The sound said, "You are small. You are temporary. You are food." They ran. Isabella dragged both children, their feet barely touching ground, running with the speed of pure animal panic. Behind them, the howling continued, rising in pitch and complexity, becoming almost speech, almost words in a language older than human tongues. Carol was screaming. Stephen was silent, which was worse. They burst from the woods onto the footpath, into streetlight and civilization, and the howling stopped as if cut with a knife. That night, Stephen stopped speaking entirely. He would remain mute for 6 weeks, and when his voice finally returned, he spoke with a slight accent his parents couldn't place, used words he shouldn't know. Carol began drawing obsessively, filling notebook after notebook with symbols that made her teachers uncomfortable. One teacher, Mrs. McPherson, who'd studied archaeology, recognized some of the symbols as matching Pictish stones from the Iron Age. She asked Carol where she'd seen them. Carol said the blue lights taught her while she slept. Isabella reported it to police. The officer taking her statement was young, overwhelmed, clearly out of his depth. He wrote everything down, promised investigation, and both of them knew nothing would come of it. How do you investigate the impossible? How do you file a report against the sky? But the reports kept coming, week after week, month after month. Different witnesses, different locations, but the same essential truth. Something was operating in the Falkirk Triangle with increasing boldness, increasing intimacy. The encounters were escalating, becoming more direct, more invasive. And in August 1992, on a dark road between Edinburgh and Tarbrax, 2 men would discover just how invasive these encounters could become. They would lose 2 hours they could never recover. And when fragments of those hours finally surfaced under hypnosis, they would learn that being seen by the lights was terrible, but being taken by them was infinitely worse. The wave was cresting. The madness was accelerating. And the worst part, the part that kept researchers awake reviewing files and testimony, was the growing certainty that this wasn't random. The encounters followed patterns. The witnesses were being selected. And whatever intelligence operated these craft, whatever motivated their visits, it was building towards something. Some culmination that the people of Bonnybridge could feel approaching like thunder in bones that remembered older skies. The old women had been right. The lights were looking for something, and they were getting close to finding it. August 1992. Gary Wood and Colin Wright were driving the A70 toward Tarbrax when the world ended and began again, and they lost 2 hours somewhere in between. The night was moonless, the kind of Scottish dark that remembers when humans huddled around fires and feared what moved beyond the light. Gary was driving, Colin riding passenger, talking about nothing important. Then Colin's voice cut off mid-word, face gone pale, staring ahead. A single light in the distance, growing, not approaching, growing, expanding, as if distance itself were collapsing. Gary's foot hit the brake, but the light kept coming, intensifying beyond anything natural. He squinted against the glare, but the light was everything now, filling the windscreen, filling the car, filling the spaces behind his eyes. Heat slammed through the vehicle like a physical blow, not gradual warmth, but instant furnace heat that made Gary's skin prickle. The smell hit next, ozone sharp as broken glass. Underneath it, something sweetly rotten, and beneath that, something chemical and utterly wrong that made his hindbrain scream predator, danger, run. Then the light touched them and the world came apart. Gary felt his body losing cohesion, felt the boundaries of his skin becoming negotiable. He tried to scream, but his mouth wouldn't work. Everything was coming unmade. The last thing he saw was Colin's face, frozen in terror, so pure it looked like religious ecstasy, and then nothing. He opened his eyes to silence and wrong, still in the driver's seat, Colin still beside him, but the car was facing the opposite direction, turned 180 degrees on a road barely wide enough for one vehicle. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. They'd entered the light just after midnight. 2 hours and 47 minutes gone, erased, deleted from their lives. Gary checked his watch to confirm malfunction. His watch agreed. 2:47 a.m. Colin, Gary managed, voice broken. Colin didn't respond. Gary touched his shoulder and Colin flinched violently, making a sound like a wounded animal. His eyes focused slowly. "What happened?" Colin whispered. "What the fuck just happened?" Neither had an answer. Just the light, then darkness, then this. The aftermath. Gary told his wife, Linda, he'd had car trouble. She accepted the lie, but noticed the smell on him. Ozone rot chemical clinging to his clothes, his skin. She noticed him standing in the shower for 45 minutes, scrubbing until his skin was raw. She noticed he couldn't sleep, just lay staring at the ceiling until dawn. 3 nights later, the screaming started. Linda woke to Gary thrashing, hands clawing air, voice torn, screaming sounds no human throat should make. When his eyes opened, they didn't recognize her. He looked at her like she was a threat. Then recognition returned and Gary collapsed, sobbing, unable to explain what he'd seen because he couldn't remember. Only the feeling, violation, invasion, being opened and examined like meat. The nightmares came every night, sometimes multiple times. Gary would wake screaming or wake silent, which was worse because silent meant he'd learned to scream internally, to keep the horror contained where it would fester. Colin's experience manifested differently. He woke one morning to find marks on his torso, small circular punctures arranged in geometric patterns, perfect triangles scored into his flesh. They didn't hurt, which made them worse. He showed his doctor, who suggested insect bites, though admitted the precision was unusual. Colin knew they weren't bites. That night he woke to sensation of new marks forming, felt something sharp pierce him in exact sequence. Shoulder, sternum, abdomen, hip. He examined himself in the mirror. Nothing. But the next morning, 4 new punctures forming a perfect square. The marks kept coming. New patterns every few days, covering his torso in geometric scars that, when analyzed, proved to follow sacred geometry, golden ratios carved into human flesh. 6 weeks after the incident, the memories started bleeding through. Gary was at work when smell memory hit him, that chemical wrought ozone scent. Suddenly, he was strapped to something that knew his body shape, held him without restraints because his muscles wouldn't respond. The space around him curved in impossible directions, walls folding through dimensions his eyes couldn't track. Light pulsed everywhere and nowhere, rhythm trying to synchronize his heartbeat. The vision ended. Gary was back in the ambulance, partner asking if he was okay. He said fine, but spent his break trying not to vomit. The flashbacks increased. Sensory triggers dragged Gary back into fragments of missing hours. He saw the beings, or tried to. His mind kept refusing to hold the image. They were tall, he thought, or felt tall. They moved wrong, glided rather than walked. Where their faces should be was absence, void, holes in reality that pulled at his vision. Colin started hearing the voice, not external sound but internal presence, words appearing directly in his consciousness, multiple voices speaking in unison, creating meaning through resonance. The voice spoke about time, how humans experienced it linearly because of limitation, like insects seeing only 2 dimensions. Time was landscape they could navigate. They'd been on Earth for millennia, the voice said, watching humanity, taking samples across centuries to track evolution. Colin tried to ignore it, told himself trauma-induced psychosis, but the voice knew things Colin didn't know. It described ancient Glasgow with architectural detail he later verified in historical records. It spoke about future events that unfolded exactly as described days later. He started drinking to silence it. But drunk Colin found himself having conversations with the presence, arguing with entities that might exist in his head or in dimensions adjacent to perception. His wife, Sarah, found him in the garage one night, shouting at empty space, demanding they leave him alone. Sarah asked who he was talking to. Colin looked at her with eyes gone strange and said, "The harvesters. They're explaining the harvest." Gary's colleagues staged an intervention. He'd been reliable but now made errors, lost focus. They suggested counseling. Gary finally broke down and told his supervisor about the A70, the missing time, the nightmares. His supervisor suggested hypnotherapy, not as treatment but as memory recovery tool. Other abduction witnesses had used hypnosis to retrieve lost time. Gary found Dr. Helen Walters, who'd worked with trauma victims and UFO cases. Colin agreed to use a different therapist, ensure their accounts couldn't contaminate each other. Gary's session came first. Dr. Walters guided him into trance, approached the gap. Gary's body responded before his mind, heart rate spiking, breathing rapid, hands clenching. The memories came like a dam breaking. The light took them. Gary felt his body lifted through the car's roof as if metal were mist. Paralyzed but conscious, watching the car shrink below, the road become a thread. Colin floated beside him, eyes open, screaming silently. Then inside, the table thing held him in perfect immobility. The beings approached. Too tall, proportioned wrong, limbs bending at too many joints. Their skin shifted colors, textured like metal but moving like flesh. No mouths but eyes. Huge, dark, reflective mirrors showing Gary his own terror across infinite reflections. Instruments descended, tools that looked biological, seemed alive, pulsing and warm. They touched his skin and he felt penetration, felt himself opened in ways that should kill. He felt them inside his chest, examining his beating heart, in his skull accessing his brain, reading memories like files. Pain came in precise doses, deliberately applied, carefully calibrated. They were testing pain response, measuring tolerance, documenting suffering with clinical detachment. Gary screamed, but his throat produced no sound. Then the voice. All beings speaking as one, delivering pure meaning. You are temporary. Your species is young. We have been here since before your kind learned fire. You call it abduction. We call it harvest. Your genetic material, your emotional responses, your capacity for suffering, these have value in exchanges you cannot comprehend. You will forget this. Your mind will seal it away because holding it would shatter you. But we have marked you. Your pattern is recorded. When the final harvest comes, we will return for you specifically. The words came with visions. Earth from orbit, time-lapse of cities rising and falling like waves, civilizations blooming and dying while something watched from above, patient and eternal. Harvests before, ancient humans taken from Stone Age camps, medieval peasants lifted from villages, modern humans abducted from cars and bedrooms, millions over millennia, all cataloged. They showed him purpose, or tried to, but his mind couldn't hold the concept. Something about preserving templates, about humanity being part of larger experiment that wouldn't conclude for centuries. They showed him future Earth, emptied, cities silent, new things walking where humans once walked. Not apocalypse, transition. The farm moving to new crops. Then darkness. Then the car facing wrong, time gone. Gary came out of hypnosis weeping, shaking. Dr. Walters held him, asked if he wanted to stop. Gary shook his head. He needed it out, in the light where he could see it, maybe survive it. Collins' session 3 days later with Dr. James Morrison produced an account so similar, both therapists compared notes despite confidentiality concerns. The details matched with impossible precision. The geometry, the beings, the instruments, the voice of harvest. The only difference was Collins' message focused on time manipulation, on beings navigating temporal dimensions. They showed him human history as simultaneous rather than linear, all moments existing at once. They'd taken humans from the 14th century and 21st in the same afternoon. Time was landscape, and they were travelers. Both men took polygraph tests. Both passed. The examiner noted when questioned about missing hours, both showed stress responses consistent with severe PTSD, trauma levels of combat veterans or torture survivors. Something had happened. Something real enough their bodies remembered. The aftermath was worse than memory. Gary started experiencing precognition, knowing who was calling before phones rang, dreaming mundane events that unfolded exactly days later. The beings had left something behind, some fragment of perception. Gary could feel it growing in his mind, expanding consciousness in directions human minds weren't meant to stretch. Collins' hands started moving on their own, drawing symbols and equations, mathematical expressions he didn't understand, geometric patterns that hurt to look at. He showed one notebook to a physicist friend who went pale and asked where Colin got these equations. They described unproven quantum principles. Colin burned the notebooks, but the knowledge remained, growing, reshaping his thoughts into increasingly alien patterns. Both men changed. Some essential part was gone, scooped out during missing hours and replaced with something other. They were marked, selected, tagged like animals in a study, carrying implants or alterations that would make final collection easier. And they weren't alone. The Falkirk Triangle was producing similar cases with terrifying frequency. People losing time, recovering memories of tables and beings, and cold voices explaining harvest. People carrying marks. People hearing voices. people changing in ways humanity couldn't accommodate. The pattern was clear. This wasn't observation. This was systematic extraction. This was farming. But farming implies ultimate harvest, eventual culmination. What happens when they've taken enough samples, documented enough data? What happens when the harvest is complete and the fields need clearing for whatever comes next? Gary Wood lies awake feeling the thing in his head, growing, preparing him. Colin Wright draws symbols in sleep, wakes to pages filled with instructions for building things human technology can't construct. Both know with certainty that feels like prophecy, they will be taken again. The marking was just beginning, and when the harvesters return, Gary and Colin won't be coming back. The old Scots were right. Where the earth remembers, the sky never forgets. And the Falkirk Triangle remembers everything, while the sky watches and waits and counts down to harvest with patience older than human civilization itself. November 1979, Deshmont Law. Robert Taylor walked into the woods a forester and walked out marked for harvest. The morning was cold, mist hanging in the trees like something living. Taylor, 61, former soldier, steady man who'd never told a lie that mattered, parked near Livingston and headed into familiar forest. Routine work. He'd walked these woods 1,000 times. But the woods remembered him, and something in them had been waiting. He came to a clearing that shouldn't exist. In the center hovered a sphere, dark metal surface 20 feet across, suspended on spinning protrusions that made no sound. Taylor's dog, a reliable animal that had tracked deer and faced down foxes, began whimpering and retreated. The dog knew. Animals always know. Taylor should have run, but he walked forward, pulled by curiosity that felt like compulsion, like his legs were moving without full consent. 3 steps toward the craft. That's when the smaller spheres dropped. 2 of them, size of barrels covered in metal spikes like medieval weapons. They hit Earth with impact that shook the ground, then rolled toward him with hunting precision. Taylor turned to flee, but they flanked him, one each side, and slammed into his legs. The spikes pierced his trousers, pierced his flesh, and Taylor felt himself being dragged backwards across the clearing toward the hovering sphere. His boots tore furrows in soil. His hands grabbed at grass and roots that came away bloody in his grip. The spiked spheres rolled methodically up and down his legs, the protrusions tearing fabric and skin in deliberate patterns, carving symbols into his flesh. He could see the larger craft growing closer, an opening appearing in its hull, darkness inside that wasn't absence of light, but presence of something else, something that wanted to swallow him. If he went into that darkness, some primal part of his brain knew he would never come out human. Then sound erupted, hissing so loud it felt physical, accompanied by smell of burning that seared his nostrils. Chemical and organic fused, meat cooking, plastic melting, and underneath something his brain filed as wrong smell, the scent of places humans were never meant to go. Taylor's vision blurred, the world tilted, consciousness fled. He woke 20 minutes later, alone. The clearing was silent, the craft gone, the spheres vanished, but evidence remained. Trousers shredded in parallel lines, legs bleeding from geometric puncture wounds, furrows in earth where he'd been dragged, and deep impressions where something massive had rested. Taylor stumbled to his truck but couldn't drive. Too shaken, too disoriented. He walked to Livingston, collapsed. Hospital. His wife arrived to find him pale, incoherent, muttering about attack. Police came with their careful neutrality, the expression of officers who've heard too many impossible things from this region. But they investigated, photographed the clearing, measured the ground impressions, over 40 of them, arranged in patterns suggesting machinery with configuration unlike anything in British engineering. The clearing itself was surrounded by dense forest with no vehicle access. Whatever had been there arrived from above. Officially, assault by unknown persons. Unofficially, no fucking idea. Robert Taylor never changed his story. Until his death in 2007, he maintained what he'd seen. Researchers suggested stroke, hallucination, ball lightning. Taylor, who'd seen combat without flinching, insisted on truth. But he didn't tell them everything. In the hospital that night, lying in darkness, fragments surfaced, being inside the sphere, a space that curved through dimensions his eyes couldn't process, figures conducting examination with instruments that felt alive, warm and pulsing against his skin, and a voice, not heard but experienced, telling him he'd been selected, cataloged, that they would return when harvest time came. Taylor refused hypnosis, refused further investigation. He wanted to forget, to seal it away. But dreams never stopped, and twice more before his death, he woke to find new marks on his body, geometric patterns appearing overnight that matched the original 1979 wounds. The harvesters had marked him, and they'd been maintaining their claim. This is the truth the Falkirk Triangle has been screaming for millennia. The truth the standing stones were erected to mark. This land is a farm, and we are the crops. The ancient Celts knew. Their word sluagh didn't mean ghosts or demons. It meant the host, the ones who fly through night in craft of light and metal, taking people into sky, returning them changed, or not returning them at all. The descriptions persist across centuries with disturbing consistency. Silent craft, beings that move wrong, examinations, missing time, people altered by contact with something operating outside human frameworks. The church tried to demonize these accounts, fold them into Christian devil lore. But the stories survived because they were true, or close enough to truth that suppression only made them stronger. The sluagh weren't spiritual entities. They were harvesters, and they'd been working this territory since before Christianity, before Rome, before recorded history. Rosslyn Chapel outside Edinburgh, built 1446, contains impossible knowledge carved in stone. Among the Christian imagery are depictions of maize and aloe vera, American plants carved decades before Columbus sailed. Geometric patterns encoding mathematical constants unknown until the Renaissance. And most disturbing, what researchers identify as DNA's double helix structure, rendered 500 years before Watson and Crick. Stand in Rosslyn at dusk when tourists have gone. Feel the weight of the place, the sense of information pressing down from the walls. Something was being recorded here. Instructions were being preserved. Not for us, for whoever comes after when the harvest is complete and Earth transitions to new tenants. The Falkirk Triangle sits on volcanic rock 300 million years old, shot through with magnetic anomalies and underground water that creates energy signatures. Instruments detect but can't explain. The standing stones align with these geological features, suggesting ancients mapped something invisible, something that flows through landscape like electricity through wire. And the region has been continuously inhabited for 8,000 years, despite brutal climate and difficult terrain. Why? What drew wave after wave of people to settle this specific ground? The ancient burial cairns, when excavated, reveal bodies positioned facing specific stars. Not random burial, deliberate orientation. The dead were placed waiting for something, watching for something's return. They knew. The people who built these stones and cairns and monuments knew they lived on harvested ground, knew the sky beings would return cyclically, taking samples, conducting studies, preparing for eventual culmination. The stones weren't monuments, they were warnings. Here be harvesters. By 2024, the Falkirk Triangle produces 45 to 60 new sighting reports annually, not decreasing, not slowing, accelerating if anything, encounters becoming more direct, more invasive. Third-kind cases, direct contact with occupants, represent the majority, inverting global statistics where such encounters are rare. This isn't observation. This is systematic cultivation. This is end-stage harvest preparation. Gary Wood, the man who lost 2 hours on the A70 in 1992, still lives near Bonnybridge. He stopped working years ago, the precognitive episodes making normal employment impossible. He knows things before they happen now. Dreams events in perfect detail that unfold days later, exactly as seen. The harvesters left something in his head during those missing hours. Some fragment of their temporal perception. Some tool or sensor that's rewriting his consciousness from inside. He tells researchers the marking wasn't curiosity or scientific study. It was preparation. They're modifying select humans, expanding perception, altering consciousness to survive what comes next, or to serve what comes next. Gary isn't sure which possibility is worse. Colin Wright moved 300 miles away trying to escape, but the voice followed. Distance means nothing to beings who navigate time like landscape. The geometric scars covering his torso have spread, new patterns appearing each year. His skin becoming a map of symbols he's stopped trying to decode. His hands still draw without conscious control, filling pages with diagrams that physicists examine in disturbed silence, before asking where he obtained classified information about theories that don't officially exist yet. Both men know they'll be taken again. The initial marking was claim of ownership. The examinations were processing. The alterations are preparation. And the final collection is coming. They feel it approaching the way animals sense earthquakes, the way birds flee before tsunamis, some deep biological warning system screaming danger, change, end. And they're not alone. Across the Falkirk Triangle, others carry marks, others hear voices, others know too much, dream of harvest, wake with knowledge planted in their minds like seeds in soil. The numbers grow annually. Whatever the harvesters are preparing, they're accelerating toward culmination. Isabella Sloggett's children, Stephen and Carol, who saw the blue sphere in 1992, are adults now. Stephen works in Glasgow as software engineer but experiences temporal displacement. He'll be at his desk and suddenly it's 3 hours later with no memory of the gap. Work completed that he doesn't remember doing. Code written in languages he doesn't consciously know. Carol is an artist whose paintings disturb gallery owners enough to reject them. She paints the harvest over and over, vast craft descending on cities while people below are pulled upward through buildings like the structures aren't solid, like human flesh isn't solid, like everything we think is permanent is actually permeable to technologies we can't comprehend. The old women of Bonnybridge are dreaming again. New visions, darker than before. They dream of sky opening not in single location but everywhere simultaneously, of harvest occurring globally in coordinated extraction. They dream of the ground releasing what it's been holding, of buried things rising, of standing stones activating like beacons, signaling harvest ready, come collect. Mrs. Elspeth Grant, 93 now, who survived the Blitz without fear but has slept with lights on since 1989, tells her great-grandchildren that the harvesters are in final preparation, that this generation won't die natural deaths because natural deaths imply time we don't have. She says the children born in Bonnybridge now come out marked, that she can see it in their eyes, some fundamental difference that wasn't there in previous generations. They're being prepared in the womb now. born ready for harvest. The skeptics dismiss all of it: weather phenomena, aircraft, sleep paralysis, shared delusion, attention-seeking. The rational explanations are comfortable, allow people to file away the Falkirk Triangle as curiosity, as entertainment, as anything except what it actually is. Proof that we are not the apex, not the owners, not even the primary residents of this planet. We are crops, and harvest season approaches. Robert Taylor died in 2007 at 88. His final words to his daughter were, "They're coming back. Tell people they're coming back." She didn't understand then. She understands now, waking to find the same geometric marks on her own body that appeared on her father's, carrying his bloodline and therefore his marking, tagged for collection like he was. Gary Wood and Colin Wright know their time is limited. The harvesters told them under examination, when the harvest comes, marked individuals will be taken first, processed first, because the alterations make them compatible with whatever comes after. They're not being saved. They're being converted, prepared to survive in conditions that will kill unmodified humans, or prepared to serve as intermediaries between harvesters and whatever reduced human population remains. The Falkirk Triangle isn't unique. It's just the most active, the most documented, the most honest about what's happening. Similar zones exist globally, places where the veil is thin, where harvest has been ongoing for millennia, where the sky watches and the earth remembers and people vanish or return changed or don't return at all. But Scotland is different because Scotland kept the records. The standing stones, the cairns, the carvings, the stories passed through generations despite suppression. The Scots documented the harvest because they knew someone would need to understand when the time came. When the final collection began and humanity needed to grasp, in those last moments, what we'd always been. Temporary tenants on borrowed land, cultivated by intelligences older than our species, waiting for the day we'd ripen enough for picking. That day is coming. The witnesses feel it. The marked ones know it. And the harvesters, patient as geology, cold as vacuum, are preparing for culmination of a process that began before human civilization existed and will conclude after human civilization ends. The mist over Scotland conceals many things, but not forever. The old Scots understood. Where the earth remembers, the sky never forgets. And in the Falkirk Triangle, both earth and sky are preparing for remembrance to become action, for cultivation to become harvest, for the farm to be cleared and new crops planted in soil enriched by what we leave behind. Robert Taylor touched the darkness in 1979, and it marked him for collection. Gary Wood and Colin Wright were taken in 1992 and returned modified, prepared. Hundreds more across decades have encountered the harvesters and carry their alterations, willing or not. They all say the same thing now, the marked ones, when they speak honestly in the small hours when fear overwhelms discretion. The harvesters aren't coming. They're already here. They've always been here. We've been living on their farm our entire history, mistaking cultivation for civilization, mistaking their patience for our independence. And now, after millennia of preparation, after generations of marking and modifying and cataloging, the harvest is nearly complete. The final collection approaches, and when it comes, it will come fast, comprehensive, unstoppable. The Falkirk Triangle is screaming this truth to anyone who will listen. The standing stones marked it. The ancient stories preserved it. The modern witnesses confirm it. We are not alone. We have never been alone. And the beings who share our world are not visitors or explorers or curious observers. They are farmers. And autumn is here.